What do most Fortune 500 executives have in common? They learned important lessons on the fields and courts of their high school and collegiate sports teams. This is true for both men and women. Ernst & Young found that a whopping 94% of women holding a C-suite position played sports. Their wins and losses shaped their habits and who they would become. Join me on my journey to sit with some of the brightest executives in the world as we discuss how sports shaped their professional trajectory in life. I'm your host, Don Yeager, and this is Corporate Competitor Podcast. We continue Technology Month with Jill Billhorn, CDW's Senior Vice President of Corporate Sales. Jill is our first gymnast on the show, and today we will do a backflip into the lessons she learned on the mat that she still uses today. Although she gave up the floor routines and balance beam long ago, her competitive spirit is still alive. Jill has participated in numerous marathons and charity runs, and today she brings her competitiveness to the incredible sales team at CDW.
I do a lot of presentations in front of very large crowds. I absolutely love it. I get ready for it like it would be a competitive event. I want to be the best speaker on the agenda. I want to make sure that people put their phones down. I want to surprise them with some information that might keep them engaged. And to me, that's my playoffs. I mean, that is my Super Bowl.
Jill, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Don. I am thrilled to be here, and thank you for asking.
Well, I love that one of the things we've done while building out these stories is that we're learning from all kinds of different sporting experiences. I will tell you, you are our first gymnast, so this is kind of cool. So I'd love to ask, thinking back to your childhood there in Dalton, Illinois, what do you remember about early gymnastics, tumbling, whatever it might have been called back when we were all little? What do you remember?
So according to my parents, very early on, I spent much of my childhood upside down. So either on headstands, handstands, I just really enjoyed the flexibility of moving my body around. So at about age 7, my mom decided it's probably a good idea to harness that flexible energy and send it into something more formal. So I started officially going to gymnastics class probably about age 7.
What was that initial attraction? You know, when you're actually, it's one thing to do handstands out in your backyard, but now suddenly you're in classes and there's some disciplines to that. Just wondering in that early stage, some of that impact on you.
So it was something that came fairly natural to me. So I think as many kids moving into sports, I think parents start to recognize something that they enjoy doing and then try to, harness that in a more formal way. What was interesting is, so if I was 7 or 8, that was, really early, like 1970-ish, early 70s. And so I was thinking back on it, it was the time when gymnastics started to explode. So think back of the 1972 Olympics, the 76 Olympics, Olga Corbett, gymnastics just accelerated past the, more sort of dancing type of sport into a real athletic and almost dangerous, I think, sport as it advanced significantly around its difficulty. I think it was a bit of a perfect storm because of that energy around the Olympics, around what women in particular were doing to change that dynamic in that sport from less of an athletic and, more of a dangerous and truly powerful sport. So I think that was part of it too. And being able to feel like I could be strong and do something with my body that was also really fun to do. I always thought, at that age, you kind of feel like it's as close to flying as you can imagine. If you can do something that physical with your body, whether it's tumbling or, any of the other apparatus. But then it really caught on, I think, in the world, and it just really clicked with me.
Yeah. Sometimes it's a little difficult to identify what you're learning in those moments, though. Yes, it's enjoyable. And yes, there's a challenge and a stressor being placed on you physically and others. But sometimes it's difficult to identify the lessons that a sport or sports are teaching you when you're still in the moment, right? You're just doing it. In fact, we have a great session in one of our episodes, episode 8, with a great leadership developer named John Maxwell, who talked about the ability to go back and reflect is truly valuable because it helps you understand kind of a great piece of your root leadership skills. Looking back, can you think of lessons that gymnastics might have taught you that you might today be able to reflect upon?
So back then I joined a club team, and it was run by a very, very autocratic German man coach, very strict, very structured, which was helpful, I think, at that time, because there's a repetition around a sport like gymnastics, something that you do over and over and over and over again to perfect, which fell in line with his way of managing, which was more disciplined and structured. And while I was a natural gymnast from an enjoyment standpoint, I certainly wasn't the best. I was somebody who had to really work hard. I wasn't naturally a daredevil. And there were certainly at that time, my teammates that were amazing to me. And so I found, though, that for me, I had to find my space, which was the work ethic around doing something over and over and over again and getting as good as I possibly could so I could be as consistent as possible, and to utilize the admiration that I have for some of my teammates to push me to try things that were a little outside my comfort zone. But I'm not sure some of his methods would go over with parents as well nowadays, honestly, because it was pretty strict, and it was without a lot of praise, but it taught me really early on the discipline and determination I had just to stick out and just to actually get some positive feedback from someone who was very, very, didn't do it very often, put it that way.
Didn't give you much feedback that was positive, and then you had to, in some ways, you could rebel against that or you could crave it.
Sure.
Yeah. But I was struck there by part of your answer was your admiration of what some of your teammates were doing that really kind of caught and drove you. Was there something in particular you remember?
Yeah, so it was 3 of us who started out that young of age at this club, and we were teammates through high school. So it was, a long-standing relationship, and it was really more of a getting past your fear of trying new things. They just had a little bit less of an element of fear than I did. And so watching them push themselves really helped me decide that I was going to push past some of those challenges in that area.
What a great lesson that is, and to be able to be taught it by your peers.
Yeah.
Pretty awesome. Your gymnastics experience did translate into you going to the University of Illinois, becoming a member of the cheerleading team, and ultimately becoming co-captain, and having had a lot of friends over the years who participated as collegiate cheerleaders. I know how demanding that practice and game schedule is. And it's so funny because people just think it's just, you're just showing up to, but the schedule's crazy. What did that window teach you about balance?
Mm-hmm. So kind of back to what I was talking about around the structure, discipline, I found myself having to be really organized. I couldn't waste a lot of time. And they always say, give a project to a busy person because they'll just figure out how to fit it into I just was not able to waste a lot of time. We traveled for football, we traveled for basketball, and on top of practicing. And it required me to make sure that I took every moment to make sure I got my studies done. There were times I couldn't attend class because we would be, traveling to, and this is back in the 80s. I know it's much more now, but we didn't fly, of course. We were driving to all of those locations in the Big Ten, but
in the middle of the winter.
In the middle of the winter, we had to take advantage of all that time. But interestingly enough, many of my teammates, we were retired gymnasts or, gymnasts from high school. And gymnastics was a big piece of the cheerleading experience as well, as you can see with some of the great gymnasts that are cheerleaders today. So we were all a combination of gymnasts and also huge sports fans. So I always felt like I was able to take a great opportunity. I had a front row seat to every game at every location. I got to meet so many fantastic coaches. Bobby Knight's probably my favorite story, but just being in that environment, if you're a sports fan, you are right down in the thick of it. And the gymnastics experience that I had in conjunction with being a sports fan just fit absolutely perfectly. And many of my teammates came from the same cloth.
You can't tease me with a Bobby Knight reference like that.
Oh my gosh.
I got to hear it.
This is back in the early 80s when Lou Henson was our basketball coach.
Uh-huh.
God love him. He just passed.
I love
He's
Lou.
a wonderful man. And, Bobby and I used to pick on him all the time just because he was a nice guy.
Oh, yeah.
The luncheon, the Big Ten opening basketball luncheons used to be brutal. He was just so rude and
roast everybody.
Such a bully. And yet here he was, this imposing coach. I can remember standing in front of him as we were warming up. And being in front of him, I'm sure people know, but he's a very big guy. He's a bigger guy than I think that I even anticipated. So I was warming up in front of him. And there was some rift between he and Lou and had happened recently. And so the crowd was really, really on him about it. And as we started to leave the court, he walked up to me and he put his arm around me and he just said, "Could you just get this crowd off my ass?" And here I am cheering for the other team. And it struck me just like how imposing and intimidating of a person he was just in that instance. It made me always reflect on obviously some of the additional stories from his players. And he had a extremely imposing personality that I won't forget that moment. It was pretty scary, but.
Did you respond?
I probably said something like, "Okay, coach," something really clever like, "Okay, coach." But, just a huge personality. And to be right there down in the thick of it was just an amazing experience. It's one of those experiences that I didn't even have to look back on. I knew then it was an amazing experience. We tried to take advantage of it all the time.
That's fun. You've mentioned twice now, both collegiately and in your club teammates
Mm-hmm.
and their influence on you. Do you keep in touch with any of those teammates and those folks?
Absolutely do. Particularly my co-captain, my senior year on the cheerleading squad at Illinois. We've remained great friends. And, it's a bond that you have, and several others actually that I remain friendly with, that what we shared, and again, back to us being, long-lived sports fans. So it's usually around a sports activity that we're still commiserating on. I just think it's a bond that was created around something that was so joyful at the time. It's long lasting. So
that's fun. I had the honor of interviewing Gabby Douglas a couple of years ago for a magazine piece, and she and I were talking about coaching strategy of the Olympic staff. And one thing she referenced that stood out was the staff there was always striving in practice to create pressure, mm-hmm. or some version of it, where the pressure of the practice actually made them better in competition. Gabby's quote, though, was, in practice, everyone on the team would come over to watch her routine. And the deal was that the coaches would tell her, if you fail in the routine, the team runs 20 laps. She talked about how that practice under pressure helped her when she ultimately got to the world's biggest stage. Mm-hmm. Wanted to get your sense of that.
Mm-hmm. So I was thinking about this. I always wanted to watch my competition as opposed to not seeing them, because in many cases it might alter something I did. If for some reason I needed to hit a certain threshold, I might alter something in a routine to make sure that I was able
on the fly.
Yes, right.
Wow.
Because I would know what the benchmark is,
right.
or how they had performed, and I might be able to alter my performance based on that.
What does that teach you from an athletic standpoint in your preparedness for moments when you'll ultimately compete?
I was thinking about that now, and how does that relate from a competitive standpoint? To me, I do a lot of presentations in front of very large crowds.
Mm-hmm.
I absolutely love it. It is something I really enjoy. And yet the pressure is pretty high, especially, in the last few years when I've had to present in front of hundreds of people at a time. And to me, that's my playoffs. I mean, that is my Super Bowl. I get ready for it like it would be a competitive event. I want to be the best speaker on the agenda. I want to make sure that people put their phones down. I want to surprise them with some information that might keep them engaged. And it's probably because I have a relatively short attention span and I don't like sitting, in front of people that are not interesting. So to me, that's my competitive stage. And it's around being as prepared as possible. We practice those things. And that is what I get up for. I want to make sure that people are engaged. In a world where distraction is higher than ever, can you keep someone engaged in that world? So that's my competitive fun now.
Tell me about your preparation now. How do you prepare today for those big time presentations? What are some of the things you do to get yourself ready and in the moment?
I try to think about myself sitting in the seat and try to understand whether that would be interesting. I try to avoid, just this very specifically, I try to avoid words and use images in all of my presentations if I possibly can. I mean, there's nothing more boring to me than reading words on a slide. I mean, how could I show that information in a more interesting way? So I try to use myself as a benchmark and then memorize to the point where I can deliver it while still receiving feedback from the crowd at the same time. But you have to really know your material in order to be able to do that.
Yeah. And again, if you, from your high school experience, right, the gymnastics experience, if you can make adjustments on the fly based upon what you're seeing from your audience, that's certainly a gift and a gift to them, right?
Right. Yeah.
I love that. That's really cool. So that idea of actually watching your competition when you were coming up through the athletic ranks, do you remember a specific event where you might have made an adjustment that you could reflect on and share?
I do. Because not all schools had gymnastics teams even back then. I mean, it's a sort of a smaller number. So we clearly, over my high school career, competed against the same athletes for multiple times. So we knew each other very well. There was I don't know if I should say her name, but there was a gal that I competed with all through high school on balance beam in particular. And we were very competitive. And it was my senior year. We were in a sectional meet. So we would have then advanced to the state meet after this. She had already competed and she was leading in balance beam and I was still to compete. So I knew what her score was and I knew what I had to beat. And I was actually on the beam and I remember I had pretty solid routine. I was very consistent. I worked really hard. So I wasn't necessarily super flashy, but you could always count on the fact that I made very few mistakes. And I remember deciding which dismount I would do because I knew what score I had to beat and I knew what routine I had going so far. So I changed the dismount I did off the balance beam just to make sure that I would beat her. And I beat her by a very small, I think I got like a 7.8 and she got like a 7.3 on her routine. And I beat her for that sectional title. I remember it like it was yesterday.
I love it. I mean, that's the thing about competition is that it should inspire great memories, wins and losses, both. It should get you.
Yeah.
You know, as we reached out to you, that the premise of this podcast came from some research that showed that a disproportionate number of Fortune 500 executives were actively engaged in sports, either at the high school or collegiate level, and that experience ultimately did help shape the way that they lead today. So in your role, I mean, you hire plenty of folks. Does the idea that others have participated in sports catch your attention? And how would you describe the importance of that?
So I think in two ways, and I'll talk about this around sales in general.
Sure.
To me, sales is significantly reflective of how sports is determined. So sales as sport, why do I think that there's a connection there? Well, number one, the outcome is unknown. If you're in a sales organization, the outcome is unknown, just like the score is unknown in any sport. And so the opportunity to carve your own outcome, it's not set in stone. What you're going to earn based on yourself is not set. Where unlike many industries, if I'm an accountant, if I'm an engineer, I mean, I know what I'm going to make in a year. I mean, it's kind of set. In sales, the outcome is unknown, and you have the ability to shape the outcome. And I think that's so exciting. I've never wanted to know how much money I was going to make in a year. That was the beauty of it. It wasn't set in stone. Could be great. It could be not so great, but it's unknown, and I have an opportunity to shape that.
To impact it.
To impact as an outcome.
Right.
The second piece is sales is an individual sport, but you work on a team. So if I look at sports like gymnastics, sports like tennis, sports like golf, I was an individual contributor, and yet I was part of a team, and we had a team goal, and yet I was competing as an individual. It's very similar. If I'm an individual contributor and I'm a seller, I have an individual goal, and yet I'm part of a team, and I can shape the outcome. So I feel like there's just a real significant combination of those two worlds.
Well, so that's perfect, and a perfect transition as we kind of begin a little bit of a pivot, because I want the listeners here to understand how you use some of your decision making, and maybe even a little storytelling, if we could,
Sure.
about how what you've experienced in your sporting past affects how you do. We often hear like people talk about the folks that work with them as a team, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the truth is, you and I know, having experienced teams, that what they really are is just a collection of folks either wearing the same jersey or collecting the same check. I mean, it's really, the truth is they're not a team in the sense that I think we would appreciate. I'd love your take. When you look at the organizations you lead or have led, what's the difference between a team and that collection of folks who might call themselves that, but truly aren't?
Yeah. In many cases, it's the leader. It's the leader of the team. I think about why people go into management. Why would you ever go from being an individual contributor to being a manager? For me, it was because I have a fascination about people. I think they're the most fascinating things in the world, and they all bring their own interesting dynamic to the table. When you talk about curiosity, which is a big focus, it's a very important piece of being successful. The curiosity around people is something that I think all great managers have. And you can't fake it. It has to be genuine curiosity about people. So you can bring a collective group together. And I've seen every great salesperson, their different shapes, sizes, types of skills, backgrounds. That's not where they intersect. There's a drive, a determination, a fearlessness around folks who are great sellers. But it's up to the manager to have the curiosity about understanding why it is they do what they do. I look for great managers who are curious about what makes their people important and and again, unfortunately, it's not something you can fake. It's got to be a genuine fascination. And I feel that about both my sellers and the people in management.
How do you measure that? How do you, as you're picking a manager or someone that might ultimately work for you, how do you look to determine their level of curiosity?
I think if I have a seller who wants to move into management, it's sort of a skill that you can bump up against everything. Do they show curiosity and interest to their customers? So as a seller, that's their team, their book of business, their customers. Do they treat those customers in that way? Are they demonstrating that skill in their world of being an individual contributor, and can it translate? And I feel like I can tell generally just working with someone whether or not that's evident.
You know, you've hit right on a point that I think is so important, and that many of these interviews that we're doing for this podcast have really brought out, is how many of the great leaders that we're talking to, have curiosity as a shared link. So one question for you, as you've progressed and you've, your title and business card keeps getting cooler and better, how do you continue to drive curiosity as you continue to climb?
For me, it's to stay closest to the customer as possible, closest to the folks who talk to the customer. I have, people would probably describe that you get a little rarefied air sometimes where, by the time an issue gets to you or something gets to you, it's like that telephone game. It may not be anywhere near what it really looks like. So I think it's about going back to having connections where the customer and my company and the seller meet, because that can cut through a lot of multiple conversations if I can just go and see it myself. And that's a very important connection. I think you got to be careful not to get too far away from where the action happens. Otherwise, it can be a little different than what you think.
Boy, that's a great tip right there, because it is easy, as you said, as you climb the ladder, to become less and less connected to that downstream beneficiary, right? The person who ultimately should be the recipient of your good work if you guys corporately are doing it right.
Yeah.
In that first half of the conversation, we talked about Gabby Douglas and that coach's desire to create pressure to try to get her ready for competition. I loved your line, sales is sport, because it is to me. I mean, and everything begins and ends there. But how do you create pressure, healthy pressure as a leader, or are there to help your team grow and find their own level of success?
I think it's important to deliver as much candid feedback as you can. Again, back to the style. Style is fine, but there's some derailers that can hurt folks if you're not direct about what that means for them. So again, trying to be as transparent and open and direct and candid about their strengths as possible. Feedback is a gift, but not everybody sees it that way. So I feel like if you ask for feedback, then you should be asking for all feedback. And so trying to be as transparent and effective that way to help people, not to change particularly, because again, there's all sorts of styles, but there are some helpful tips that you can give them if they don't sometimes have the self-awareness that they need.
Yeah, that is, but you're right about feedback, right? Sometimes people ask for it and then they argue. But let me tell you why. It's like, if you're going to ask for it, you need to internalize it before you respond.
Right.
So that's great.
Yep.
Another fascinating topic that came up from that interview with Gabby Douglas was that she said that it was interesting that sometimes the biggest competition is your own teammate, right? And so here you are, ostensibly, as you said, it's an individual sport, but you're part of a team. But then the person you most need to best is someone wearing the same uniform. And that's true in sales.
Yes.
Gabby said we love cheering for each other, but at the same time, I want the gold too.
Yep.
How might you think through or manage that concept as a sales leader?
So I find if I look back at some of the roles I've had, it seems to be roles where I'm taking over an organization that is either in distress, has a terrible self-identity, or just a fixer-upper. I work a little bit with a chip on my shoulder, I think. I love the underdog conversation. My first role at CDW was taking over an organization of small businesses. And they used to call it little business. So it made no sense to me, because what these sales folks could do, they were the most tenacious. They had the biggest sense of urgency. What they could sell on the phone to customers was amazing to me. They had a terrible self-identity, so they didn't understand that they were that great. So we just remarketed this whole idea. We called it small business is the place to be. That was our mantra. Don't just come here because you want to go someplace else and just as a stepping stone. It's the place to be. You can be successful here. And I couldn't have done that unless I really believed that that was true. And today, small business spun off as its own business unit. It is one of the best, most consistent growth engines in the company.
Sure is.
Partly because they believed that they were. They developed some things they were really great at and unique things they were great at, but they just didn't know that it was there. So that's just an example of areas that I think that I tend to get put on those projects that are a bit of a fixer-upper. So, but I love that. I love that idea. I love that everybody thought we couldn't do it. And that is kind of what drives me.
Yeah, you have that Joanna Gaines look to me right there too. Awesome. I read in the Fort Lauderdale Sun-Sentinel that you were a panelist on a fascinatingly titled program, Bridging the Gap, Attracting and Developing Women Technology Leaders, right?
Yeah.
It's a huge issue, obviously, trying to make sure that we're making the industry as attractive as possible. And one challenge for some women in certain industries is finding great mentors and sponsors who will invest in and help them manage their journey.
Mm-hmm.
Now, women at CDW have you to look up to, which I think is pretty cool. But I'm wondering, who were those you looked up to? And, who were some of those mentor sponsors who meant something in your journey?
So I had a couple of times I had taken roles that were a little outside of the box. I can remember one of my very first roles at Xerox when I first got out of college was a little bit more of an apprentice role. I could have been a direct seller, but it was a bit of an apprentice role working for some senior leaders at Xerox. Great sales company, great sales training. And people thought I was crazy to take this role, but what I learned from some of those folks who've been doing this forever really helped groom some of my skills at a very critical time, which is right out of college, where some of the things that you learn immediately are the things that stick with you over a long period of time. I did that a couple of times. I did that when I was at AT&T. It was a really unique opportunity, actually, because I was running a sales branch and my interim boss, so I reported to someone who reported to someone who had the whole country. My interim boss was taken out, was pulled out to work on a special project. So I had direct access to his boss. Wow. And I offered myself up to just get some feedback, some direct feedback. And it was just one of those things I was able to take advantage of to work with my boss's boss to get some really direct coaching.
So as opposed to falling back, you stepped into that vacuum.
Absolutely. And it was a little scary, but because he was, I felt like he knew so much more than me, but I just sucked it like a sponge. And he kind of took me under his wing. He's somebody I still keep in touch with today. When I move into different roles, I ask him his advice around that.
He's still at AT&T today?
He is. Yep.
Yeah. I think finding that mentor is hard, especially for a lot of people. And so that's a really great tip, to be willing to, if a moment occurs that you can step forward and step in, do it.
Yeah.
Any other quick tips on that?
Yeah. So, and I will just really quickly suggest that when I came to CDW, our CEO, Tom Richards, was an acquaintance of mine in my past, somebody I kept in touch with just casually. And when he went to CDW, we reconnected. And over a period of time, we talked about my potentially coming there, what I wanted to do. And he said, I think small business would be a really great place for you to start. I had never worked in the small business marketplace in my entire career. I had always worked with big customers. There was lots of reasons why I thought this is crazy. I don't know why you would think that. But he saw something that he thought would be a fit. And sometimes when people do that and they see that, you just got to go with it. He had confidence that it would happen. I thought, okay, this sounds kind of interesting. I'm going to give it a shot. And it turned out to be just an amazing experience. And I've been at CDW longer than any other place that I've ever worked. So sometimes when people see something in you that you think sounds crazy, but they see something in you, probably a good idea to at least listen to it, have the conversation.
Go with it, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. Last question real quick here. We talked earlier about watching the competition and how you did it athletically, but now at CDW, obviously you have some great competitors.
Yes.
How do you watch your competitors today, and what are you looking to learn as you're watching them?
So in our business, we represent all of the major manufacturers and OEMs or telecom and IT manufacturers in the world. And they all have partners that they work with, including CDW. And I think what I try to do is establish a network where I can honestly ask somebody, tell me what they do that I could do, and be ready to hear the answer, because we all want to hear how great things are and how wonderful you are. But it's like that feedback question. I try to find people that will give me honest answers about what my competition is doing that I could do better. Because for them, having a stable of great partners is only will help them. So if I improve, they improve. But it's being open and really having honest conversations with our partners to know what I could do better.
Awesome. Well, Jill, I'm so honored that you took this time, that you shared this much of yourself, the lessons taught and where you learned them and how they impact and influence how you lead your team. I had the chance to do some work with parts of your team not long ago.
In small business, actually.
Yeah, that's right. And I know how much respect they have for you. So thank you again. What an honor. And we appreciate the time you've given to all of us.
Thank you so much. It was a thrill, and I'm honored to be here. So thank you so much, Dom.
This discussion with Jill brought a new, intriguing perspective to the show. I loved it when she said, I like to think of my annual sales presentation as my Super Bowl, and I prepare for it like it was a competitive event. I challenge you to apply this to your life. Think, what deadline do you have coming up that you could reframe as your Super Bowl? Once you have an event in mind, write down, what practices do you need to hold? How can you scout your competition? Should you watch a game film of your rehearsals so that you can improve and get better? We know that competition breeds success and that preparation is power. So take the genuine curiosity we talked about today and go out and be great. Thanks for listening to the show. Did you like what you heard? If so, subscribe to the podcast. We will be rolling out a new episode every Wednesday, and you can be the first to listen. Subscribe on our website, corporatecompetitorpodcast.com, or by texting subscribe to 58885, and you will receive a free chapter of one of my best-selling books. While you're there, remember to join the Greatness community. For a free weekly leadership lesson, I write for Forbes.com and information on my live and virtual keynote speeches. Stay in touch by connecting with me on social media at Don Yeager on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. Finally, are you a corporate competitor? If so, tell me the story about a time when your athletic experience taught you a leadership lesson you still use today. Until next week, I appreciate you.